Welcome to Dallas. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Greg Berman. I'm the director of the Center for Court Innovation, and it is my profound pleasure to formally kick off the first ever international gathering of community courts. So welcome. I feel like I should have a giant gong or something ceremonial, but I just have my voice. We've got a lot of fun stuff to look forward to today, and a busy, jam-packed, and hopefully fun-filled agenda for you. But I hope you'll indulge me for just a couple of minutes, because I want to look backwards for a moment rather than forwards. As I was reminiscing with Judge Norco from Hartford last night, it's been a long, strange trip to get to this point, and I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about how we got here. This gathering and today in general has a very special resonance for me because I've really grown up as a professional alongside the community court movement, if you can call it that. My first encounter with community courts and with criminal justice in general came in the early 1990s when I went to work for a visionary guy named John Feinblatt, who was running around talking about how to come up with a new approach to misdemeanor crime in Midtown Manhattan, what would eventually become the Midtown Community Court, the first community court in the country. I think it is fair to say that John and those of us who worked for John back then were swimming against the current, a very strong current. At the time, New York was known as the ungovernable city. It was thought that crime was essentially like the weather. It was beyond the human intervention. You couldn't do anything about it. Theaters were dark, tourism was down, New York was losing people to the suburbs as people fled, largely for public safety reasons. If anything, the national scene was even more bleak than the scene in New York City. The politics of crime were highly polarized. Almost every new initiative had to be framed and sold as an effort to get tough on crime. And if the national conversation about crime was bleak, the scholarship, I would argue, was even bleaker, or at least the public perception of the scholarship. There seemed to be a pall over the field of criminal justice, much of it cast by the famous Robert Martinson study, which came to be known by the depressing shorthand that nothing works. And the idea that you could change the behavior of offenders, that you could transform crime-plagued neighborhoods, seemed, looked at best naive and at worst, hopelessly delusional. This was the context out of which the first community court, the Midtown Community Court, emerged in 1993. And I can tell you from firsthand experience working there that it was viewed as an out-of-the-box, radical, beyond-the-pale experiment, one-of-a-kind experiment. Well, not anymore. Fast forward to today. What a difference 17 years can make. New York is no longer a symbol of urban blight. In fact, it's now the safest big city in the country. But New York, of course, as many of us can attest that are here today, is not alone in experiencing public safety gains. As the Department of Justice announced just last week, the violent crime rate in the US has dropped to 17 victimizations per 1,000 people. The figure was as high as 51 victimizations when the Midtown Community Court started. And the rate of incarceration has actually begun to inch downward as well. Crime has gone from one of our most pressing national priorities to basically being a non-issue from my perspective in the most recent presidential race. Now, while the right and the left in this country still agree on many things, if not most things, there is a growing consensus across a very broad political spectrum that there are, in fact, a set of criminal justice interventions that have actually been proven to work to reduce crime. The Justice Department, as you will soon hear from my friend Mary Lou Leary, is deeply committed to advancing these interventions and has actually shown that it's willing to put its money where its mouth is. So the bottom line is that we're in a much better place in terms of the field of criminal justice than we were 20 years ago. There are many reasons for this, and I won't get into all of them, but I think that community courts can step forward and take some of the credit for this transformation that we've seen in the field of criminal justice. This is true in the United States, from Connecticut to California and many places in between. And as you will hear over the course of the next 2 days, it's increasingly true in other parts of the world as well, Australia and Canada and England and other countries. When I think about the unique contributions that community courts have made to the public conversation about criminal justice, I really focus on three things that kind of stand out for me. The first contribution that I think community courts have made is a fairly simple one, and that is that low-level offending matters. George Kelling and James Wilson may be the originators of the broken windows theory, but nobody has done more to turn this idea into action than community courts. So that's contribution number one. Contribution number two, very important. Reducing crime and reducing incarceration are not mutually conflicting goals. By taking a pragmatic, non-ideological approach to crime, community courts have shown that it is possible to do both at the same time. Contribution number three, local residents have a valuable role to play in doing justice. True and enduring justice doesn't come from living in a police state. Community courts have shown that it must be co-produced by citizens and government working together in an environment of mutual respect. So these ideas have resonated far and wide over the past 2 decades, and I think that all of us who have worked on community courts or whose lives have been touched by community courts can feel proud of the contribution that we've made. But from my perspective, I feel like the best is yet to come for this movement. Why is that? I think the current fiscal crisis that we're all dealing with actually presents some opportunities for community courts. I think it means that the interest in creating meaningful and real alternatives to incarceration, the interest in that idea has never been stronger. And the current levels of distrust and anger that are out there in these troubled times mean that there's a greater need than ever before for programs that can actually bridge the gap between citizens and government. And I think the community courts, that's the sweet spot for community courts. I think community courts can do both of those goals, achieve both of those goals. So it's my hope over the next 2 days that we will plant seeds that will help to grow and sustain this movement for many, many years to come.